Hi, today we're going to take a look at a couple of engagements that happened near the French city of Autrepierre. They basically consist of a couple classic cavalry charges, which still existed in the First World War. I think it's kind of interesting to take a look at them in regards to the way that the lances are used. This occurred during what's called the Battle of the Frontiers on the Lorraine front. It's about 1.5 weeks since the German army started to invade France and Belgium. I selected it because it captured the romantic ideal of the cavalry charging with lances down towards the enemy. And also that this particular engagement, with some differences, was recorded by both sides. While many forward thinkers, for example General Bernhardi, recognized that the lance would not be the decisive weapon in the next war to be fought by the cavalry, within the cavalry units itself, there still existed a romantic dream of glories to be achieved via the lance. Okay, now might be a good time to take a brief look at the subject of lances. What was the intent of the lance? What was the equipment that the two sides were using? And what sort of training had they received? As far as the intent for a lance, it was not jousting. It was intended as a close combat weapon for cavalry troopers who were mounted on horses. And the benefit of a lance compared to, for example, a sword, is that a lance can reach beyond the distance of the horse's body quite easily, and it can also reach to the ground. In comparison to the infantryman's equivalent, which would be a rifle with a bayonet attached, a lance is quite a bit lighter, and that makes a difference as far as the handiness in battle, as well as the load of equipment that the horse is carrying. And as we'll discuss in a future video, this was something that was carefully controlled on all sides to make sure that they were carrying the minimum amount of equipment on horses with the most impact. The lance at a reach of about 5 feet and a total reach of out to 9 feet was longer than a sword. But of course, if you got into close combat, like shoulder to shoulder with someone, then a lance became a hindrance and the sword became a handier weapon. So in general, you will find that in the training of the use of the lance, that troopers were trained to keep their opponents at a bit of a distance so that a lance would still be effective, if they were equipped with a lance. Troopers with sword, on the other hand, were encouraged to get as close as possible, and generally that would involve parrying a lance and then get inside the reach so then that they can fight from there. Now, a lance was not completely useless within that distance, and we'll see that in a moment as far as the training and the tactics that they used. Now, as far as the equipment, the French had 2 lances in use in 1914. There was the model 1890, which had an ash shaft and had a total length of 9 feet 6 inches. And then there was the model 1913, which is similar to the German lance, which was entirely steel from butt all the way up to the point. The French model 1890 lance, which was used in these encounters, was about 9 feet 6 inches long, weighed about 5 pounds 5 ounces. The point on it was about 6 inches long. It had a square section to it, and the total reach from the balance point where you would grip it with your hand to the tip of the point was about 6 feet 3 inches. The German model 1893 lance, on the other hand, was drawn soft steel from end to end. It was actually hollow, and because it would have a tendency to ring like a bell, Germans would insert blotting paper, a length of blotting paper, inside the lance before it was closed in the manufacturing process to dampen it and prevent that ringing from happening, because otherwise it's a sound that could be heard for quite a distance. The German lance had a total length of 10 feet 3 inches, so about half a foot longer than the French model 1890. It weighed about 4 pounds 11 ounces, so it was about half a pound lighter than the 1890 lance. The blade was similar, it was 5 inches instead of 6, but it was still a square section point on it. And it had a reach 5 feet from where the trooper would hold it, which is called the Schwere point, strong point, to the tip of the lance, which was a little bit shorter than the French lance. Now, that could or could not be an issue depending on the training of the trooper, and that brings up a big point here. If you gave a lance to a normal layperson, I don't think they'd have a real clue what to do with it, and most likely would not be very effective. A lance requires extensive training to be useful in the hands of a trooper. And so both sides did spend quite a bit of time and dedicated time to training on the lance. Looking at the subjects that they taught in the training, they both had covered pretty much similar topics. There would be guards and strikes from 6 directions. That would be the right front, right side, right rear, and left rear. And as I said, there would be both guards and strikes from that directions. They would also teach butt strikes, which would be with the shorter side of the lance, which is potentially rounded or not as sharp. In some cases, though, it might have been sharpened. And then there are what are called wheels, which might be used, for example, for striking a target on the ground, or as well as also clearing an area around the trooper of opponents so that they can have room to work. It has been reported that apparently, lances themselves, if you strike them or in the middle of the length, can be fragile. The wooden ash shaft of the French Model 1890 could be broken. The German steel lances would apparently bend if you struck them with force or if you got a force in the middle of their reach. So part of it is they would not use it generally in a swinging direction. With a few exceptions, they were taught that in emergency situations, you could use it to unhorse another opponent by catching him off balance or striking him in the head or potentially striking the horse's head with a butt just to upset it and then get some distance so then you could go back to using the point. The Germans, though, had additional training in basically combination strikes, so a right and a left strike in succession, a front and a back strike in succession. So they spent some additional time on those, which were only mentioned informally in the French documentation. They could do this because there was additional training time for the German trooper. The French troopers would receive about 3.5 hours a week of time with the lance, and that was over a course of an enlistment of 2 years. The Germans, on the other hand, spent 2 hours a day training with the lance, which is about similar to what they used for training with the carbine. But they would do this over a period of 3 years. So the German trooper would have had considerable more time training with the lance than the French trooper at the time of this engagement. The French did change their enlistment period in 1914 from 2 years up to 3, so they would have had one cohort within the French regiment who would have received most of 3 years of training. But compared to the German regiment, where everybody was somewhere between 1 and 3 years worth of training, it effectively worked out to an extra half a year of training for your average cavalry trooper of the two sides. So that's a brief look at the subject of lances, how they were used, and what the training was. Let's go back and see how the rest of these engagements turned out. The account of the 15th French Dragoons. Finally, on the last day of parking at Luneville on August 13th, Lieutenant Desetang of the 2nd Squad is sent with his platoon in reconnaissance south of the Luneville-Avricourt Railway in the Viejo L'Entrée Gondrexon de Mivre region. The party leave at the break of day. Lieutenant Desetang has sent useful information. He already had, during the morning, contact with enemy patrols and managed to make a prisoner. At about 2 o'clock, he has continued his reconnaissance around Chezel. Suddenly, he falls under a violent fire from a wood. He wants to turn back, but at the same time, a squadron of Uhlans falls on him and blocks the road. Lieutenant Desetang has only one exhausted platoon and in front of him a fresh enemy, 3 times greater in number. But the idea of surrender does not come to him for a moment. He rushes, followed by all his men, to the Uhlans, to receive them with revolver shots, then with their spears. The Lieutenant Desetang is killed, the Marshal de Legic-Caron too. A large number of dragoons fall after they have harmed many enemies. These, surprised by so much audacity, cannot, according to the inhabitants who reported it since then, retain their admiration for the French courage, of which they had just seen the Le Mans. They pick up the wounded and have them treated. Then they bury the dead in the Chezel cemetery after giving them the military honors. This heroic action of brilliancy cost us 11 killed and 9 wounded or missing. In total, there are 23 men hors de combat, both officers and non-commissioned officers or horsemen, and 27 horses killed or wounded. The whole pack disappeared thus. The heroic death of Lieutenant Desetang was deeply felt at the regiment. Lieutenant Desetang was mentioned sometime later to the Order of the Cavalry Corps in these terms. On August 13, 1914, sent to reconnoiter in the direction of Viejo, had happily accomplished his mission and sent useful information. surprised by a shooting and in the presence of a party of cavalry 3 times more numerous, did not hesitate to go in the attack, charged at the head of his platoon, and was killed by several blows of a spear. It had been about 1.5 weeks since the start of World War I and the German armies advanced into France. The account of Lieutenant Count von Preissing. The hot sun of the Lorraine August day burned down upon Avincourt early in the forenoon. The hot dust whirled through the shattered windows in the long rows of houses, before which the women and children watched with empathetic indifference the coming and going of the German soldiery. Here, in shelter, the Bavarian Cavalry Division waited in readiness to bring the French cavalry to battle, and to the 2nd Squadron of the 1st Heavy Cavalry Regiment at the railway station. It seemed as though this day was also going to pass without event, when all at once, on the road to Igny, the scene changed. A senior non-commissioned officer goes from house to house, cries out hurriedly to the troopers in the street, who in turn transmit the order. 2nd Squadron, saddle up and assemble in march column at the exit towards Gondrexion. 10 minutes pass. The platoons assemble under their leaders. At 10 o'clock, the squadron stood ready to march, and just as the last platoon closes up, the squadron commander, Prince Henry of Bavaria, raises his hand and gives the signal to march. With him are the platoon leaders who have reported in advance of their platoons. They are Lieutenant Count Marigna Ridowitz, Lieutenant Count Preissing, Lieutenant Baron von Dornberg, and Acting Sergeant Major Count Dumoulin. Lieutenant Count Spredi has been on patrol since early morning. Prince Henry gives the following order. The 2nd Squadron will escort the heavy artillery staff on a reconnaissance to the south of Autrepierre, preparatory to the bombardment of the forts of Menonvilliers. We march at once in the direction of Gondrexion. Lieutenant Count Maragna will command the point. The officers gallop to join their platoons. Prince rides with his staff at the head of the column. There will be no more halts. You can trust to that, say the troopers amongst themselves. Trot! We are approaching the Amenencourt wood. A few shots. Sergeant Gabler gallops back from the point. About 2 platoons of dismounted cavalry hold the heights to the west of Gondrexion. As the advance continued, enemy cavalry are also seen on the left flank, east from Gondrexion, in strength of about a squadron. These later advanced toward us rapidly in column of platoon. We have just passed the edge of the wood. Upon receiving the report from the point, Prince Henry galloped out at once and with drawn saber faced the enemy, indicating the direction to head of the squadron columns. He gave the signal, and the platoons galloped up into line. Forward! Lances lowered, the horsemen sweep across the cornfields after their prince. The latter sets a rapid pace on his black king. Hurrah! Hurrah! This charge was not taken into reckoning by the dragoons with the horsetail on their gleaming helmets when they set this trap for us. Hurrah! Hurrah! Bravore et Bavaria! The Napoleonic war cry resounds in the ears of the French. The latter have already decided to attack, but quicker than the enemy's decision had been the prince and his troopers. They wheel about and flee, while their 2 platoons, first mentioned, who had held up our point, join in the rout. Now we had a mad chase, Prince Henry quite alone, far in advance, and now also the troopers, getting out of control of their platoon leaders, strive each to be the first to overtake the cowardly curs. Today there will be no attack on the high meadow. Think Berecker, Kreuzeder, and Corporal Yall, who races along in his good ensemble, Kiermaier of the 3rd Platoon on his chestnut devise, and Sergeant Zadow on Electra. Uphill goes the pursuit to the wood of Autrepierre. Presently we must catch them. The foremost pursuers are already getting dirt and dust in their faces. The French can do nothing more. We gather them in upon arriving at the wood, for here they turn toward the left, and we take them in flank. The riders in rear now crowd up, pursuers and pursued. Crying for mercy, the French drop from their horses and open fire with pistols. 2 focal points of the ensuing combat can be distinguished. The left, Prince Henry, was the first to reach the foremost dragoon that arrived astonished at an almost impossibly marshy defile in the wood, and attacked him with brandishing saber. The next to follow, Corporal Wiedemann of the 3rd Platoon, upon Gypsy Girl, attacked toward the right with lowered lance against the second half of the French. Prince Henry received a lance wound, and his situation in the face of superior forces of the French became difficult. The dragoons see that the prince is wounded and press upon him, but from either side Sergeant Thiels de Gebhardt and Corporal Jal, saber in hand, parrying lance thrust and saber stroke, throw themselves in front of their leader and strike about at random until their prince is free. Now Sergeant Thies is also bleeding. A pistol ball intended for the prince has torn a finger of his right hand. Soon the prince is among his troopers, who grouped about him and make short work of the remaining dragoons. It has gone worse with Corporal Wiedemann. The latter had singled out his dragoon, and with his lance had thrown him off the saddle, but he received at the same time a well-aimed shot to his back and fell. To be sure, it was only a fraction of a second before the others came up, but it was too late. It was not too late for revenge, however. Right skillfully, the dragoons endeavored to single combat to pull out of their critical situation by the dexterous use of pistol, saber, and lance. They were unable to stand against the impetuosity of the heavy cavalrymen. Those who still sat on their horses sought in the midst of the confusion to gain their safety by a fresh flight. Others crept into the thick underbrush. While the men about Prince Henry chased the last of the dragoons through the forest defile, those of the right combat group now likewise pressed forward in pursuit, and as they saw the prince, whom they had lost sight of by reason of the combat and the dust, they joined in with a hurrah, and one dragoon after another was taken prisoner. In this second pursuit, Corporals Baumann, Jal, and Kleiber, Lance Corporal Kreutzader, and Private Hohenweisner especially distinguished themselves. This pursuit was continued until the Edelbach was crossed, and was only given up when the rest of the regiment endeavored to relieve their comrades. Only one officer and 3 dragoons, mounted on swift horses, made their escape. Lieutenant Baron von Dornberg's horse received a shot, as the horses of this plucky officer frequently did. In the press of the pursuit, Lieutenant Count Pricing plunged into a morass, fell into it under his horse, and was in a precarious plight, until Privates Haas and Niedermeyer, in spite of the heavy effort, dismounted and rescued their officer. The prince had the squadron assembled on the heights of Autrepierre. He himself, conducted by Lieutenant Count Pricing, proceeded to the place where Corporal Wiedemann had been wounded. There he lay dead beside his dragoon. Prince Henry exclaimed, "He was one of the best," and was greatly moved. Later, Bavarian riflemen dug here an honorable grave for this brave and good non-commissioned officer. In the meantime, Lieutenant Count Maragna had assembled the squadron. During the attack, this officer had led the point to the right, and so had to prevent the escape of any of the French in that direction, while Sergeant Major Ebinger accounted for the enemy who had fallen from their horses during the first gallop. Now the majority learned for the first time that the prince was wounded. The latter made no mention of it. With the helmets of the Lunéville dragoons at their saddles, the squadron returned toward Avricourt. During the return march, the squadron commander had Sergeant Thies and Corporals Baumann and Jal come to him and narrate the incidents of the mounted fight. He thanked us and pressed our hands. Sergeant Mayer, on friend, stuck up, "O Deutschland hoch in Ehren, du heiliges Land der Treu." Again, the villagers stood before their houses and gazed at the cavalcade, but not indifferently now, rather with terror, for they remarked the pale blue lance pennants, the lions on the buttons of the tunics, and the straight heavy swords. "Ah, mais c'est pour cela." They aren't ordinary cuirassiers, they are Bavarians. The following account is from Rittmeister Graf von Maragna Ridderwitz. On August 11th, the first heavy riders were not allowed to intervene in the Ulan attack at Lagarde, but at least the 2nd Squadron under Prince Heinrich offered themselves on August 14th at Gondraxon, if possible, to fight a heavy cavalry battle with French dragoons. The squadron had to accompany a reconnaissance staff of the heavy artillery against the Fort Menonvilliers. At Gondraxon, west of Avricourt, several French dragoons were observed to get in the way of the squadron. Occasionally bullets whistled around the ears of the horses, and finally an enemy squadron was visible approaching in a column of platoons. Immediately the order was given to gallop up and deploy. As on the training field, The closed squadron front swept across the fields. The French immediately turned to flee, for their maneuvering should, as usual, draw the Germans into a trap. A cavalry battle was not what they wanted. Too late. They were caught up in no time. There was a fine battle to do at the front. Ridden over, pierced with well-aimed lance stabs, the enemy riders and horses rolled on the ground. The fighting continued in single combat with lance and saber. The French were completely denied crossing the Abelbach on the right, and the Dragoon squadron was literally wiped out, while the alert heavy cavalry had only one dead and a few men lost to injuries, including the brave squadron chief, Prince Heinrich von Bavaria, who was slightly pierced by a lance. Okay, as a quick wrap-up, I think it's kind of interesting how each of the accounts is different. For example, the French refer to Uhlans, but the Bavarian 1st and 2nd Uhlans had been engaged at Lagarde 2 days earlier, and as a result were not active on the 13th. The Schwere Reiters had definitely engaged with the Dragoons based on the material souvenirs that they brought back. Also, all of the Dragoon deaths that day were accounted for by the engagement that they described. So was it 2 encounters, or the same encounter? Finally, regarding the court at Manonvilliers, it was ultimately engaged by the German heavy artillery battery and reduced. You can see pictures here. Hope you found this video interesting. If so, please like and subscribe for more first-person historical content like this.